Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
Hi.
we can hear you. Okay, what's up?
If there's any echo, let me know. I can switch to headphones with a mic.
You're fine. You sound fine. Yeah, we have to be a little quick with this, but go ahead.
Yeah. Quick thing. Supernova mentioned in the YouTube chat about Khadija Mbowe with the men in the left and helping men get better. She has some really good videos on that.
Based.
So just quick rec. So I have like two ways we can go with this, depending on which way y'all want to go with this. It has to do with like offense versus harm. One of them is more topical with the way discourse is going now in the terms of like public displays of kink, and the other one has to do with the depiction of mental illness in media.
You know what? Dealer's choice. Whichever one you want.
Please don't make me choose.
Let's go. Let's go with.
We can go with the media one because we haven't heard.
Yeah, let's do the media one. So shoot your
media.
shot. What is your thoughts with the media
Okay,
one? We'll do
so-
Kink at Pride another day because Jesus Christ.
Yeah, well, it's like my thing with the kink at pride thing is like there's like levels to it of when we're talking about public displays of kink, because like there's straight people. It's always straight people, and it's almost always like the femme sub male dom people who are really pushing boundaries and doing weird shit in public. And then the queer people get targeted with it. But that's a thing for another day.
We got a video on this too, by the way.
Yeah, we have videos on this. We've covered this. So yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so one thing I've generally noticed with media, and it's like we've gotten better over time, but it seems like that mentally ill people are still like a quick, easy, like punching bag for media. I've seen this a lot with like horror games, like psychological horror games in particular. And then I think I've mentioned this way before, as there was this show called Ratchet where they gave a girl boss arc to Nurse Ratchet from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where dissociative disorders were kind of like, here's the reason why this person's a villain, and then there's the movie Censor where that was the thing.
Yeah,
and
I
so
saw the trailers for it. I didn't actually watch it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is like, are you asking where that fits on the sort of this idea of offense versus harm?
Well, it's like there is the aspect of offense versus harm of like, am I just being super sensitive? Like, Ratchet is a particularly bad thing in my opinion, because it's like they also did this thing where having sex with mentally ill people is a thrill because there's the threat that they'll snap on you and kill you or something or do harm.
It's a very, very specific kink.
Yeah, there's like, well, it's also the thing is like, this is a nurse who is having sex with patients who are mentally ill. And
that
this
is a
like
very specific kink. Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Whoa, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's my thoughts on this is that, do I think you're being sensitive? No. I think that a lot of people are sort of desensitized to this, but I do think there's a way that mental illness is portrayed in a way where it is a justification for everything from villainhood to superpowers. I'm looking at you, Split.
Mm-hmm.
As a person who identifies as plural, like the idea that like I could get superpowers because of my alters, like fuck yeah, I wish that could happen. But instead, we basically just one of us is better at organization.
And complaints about the desk being messy.
So the problem is that like I think people are desensitized to this because it's very easy to look at mental illness as this othering, and I don't think that's really helpful or useful. It's something I'm seeing a lot of people shift out of, even in mental health. Like I've been to trainings where people have been basically recreating those things, and I've been to trainings where people are very much shifting out of them. And so I think that this is a cultural wide issue, and I think media is reflecting that. Rather than give people a very like meaningful, direct reason for why they're evil, we instead have to give mental illness because it's a shortcut. In some ways, it's a lazy shortcut because there's this
very
whole thing.
Lazy,
yeah, there's this whole thing where like people are now like in basically because of the whole Disney the Disney redos and all this other crazy shit they've done. There's this idea that like villains have to have like a whole bunch of reasons for the things that they do. And the problem is that like, one, that's not true. Sometimes a villain is just two-dimensional and can be fun as fucking queer. But in some cases, the other problem is that when you do mental illness, you're essentially going, no, that's the reason. And you sort of just shorthanded as to bad person with like extra steps. That's how you got there. I don't think you're being sensitive. I think this is a very real problem. I think the issue is I just don't think media knows how to portray mental illness in a way that's a way that like actually talks about like the difficulties and the good parts and the horrors and all the stuff that comes from it. And I think that to some degree it's got to be a shift that like newer writers and newer people involved in media have to make. And I think we just have to keep calling it out when it happens, because don't get me wrong, like I get why people like say for example serial killers. When I went through my undergrad, I basically like refused to go through any of the pathology classes that I didn't have to, because I hate the topic of serial killers. I don't find them interesting at all. I find them rather boring. And yet there are people that would literally like run to those classes, even people that were non-psych majors, because they really wanted to know about them. Like there's something about the idea of mental illness, especially when it goes to a particular level, that like captivates people, where it can turn you into this evil person. But that's not the day-to-day experience of most people. And so people only see these incredibly horrific versions of like shit like what, like Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs, or, you know, read about Ed Gein or any of this other shit, where instead like talk about just the difficult, like, because I think sometimes people are just interested in like, sometimes it sucks being anxious or having depression. Like you're not always going to be some, you know, a full-blown person with psychopathy. Yeah, I don't know. I guess my problem is like I think I agree with you overall. I think I'm more desensitized to it, because if I let every bad portrayal of psychological stuff get to me, I would lose my fucking mind.
Well, that and Poppy and I tend to be really, 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 really picky about what we watch. So I'm not really into watching Netflix. They're really crappy. They cut off shows very quickly, so writers can't actually like have a full writing thing. Because I do think that there are writers out there that could write much better stories. But when you're working with like a company that might just yoink the entire show because they feel like it, and some money reason apparently, that may or may not be true, then like no, you really can't do much with that, right? Like the writers from, you know, Avatar: The Last Airbender went on to do Korra, got their funding yoinked so many times. It sucked. You know, I do think have these conversations and talk about it. I think that's, and not that like there are people that we in the greater internet sphere that we know who will go really, really hard with these things and say that you are a bad person for XYZ. At the end of the day, a TV show is still fantasy. It is still a made up thing. But I think, you know, us having community discussions or discussions with the people around us, no, totally works. I really, really do.
So, yeah, and so this is what I'd add on to that, because I think ZZ's completely correct. So there's the thing is that we have to sort of reconcile the fact that like for us, we're not big into the idea of thought control. Like I don't care what you write about in fiction. I don't give a fuck like how weird it is, taboo, whatever. I'm not necessarily going to read it. That's on you, whatever. But the issue is that I generally don't give a shit, because my concern is that actions, behavior in the world that does real harm to real people is where that stuff comes up. Now, granted, when we're talking about portrayals, I think it's perfectly acceptable to critique those things, because those portrayals can lead to people getting the wrong idea about a particular group or whatnot. The other thing I would say about this is that the way we have to counter this is that if you feel comfortable to do so, and you are a person who is absolutely like in a place of privilege where you can do this, if you are dealing with mental illness, I think you should speak to it. This is why I'm very clear about the fact that I'm neurodiverse. I have ADHD. I'm very clear about the fact that I have BPD. I'm also very clear these days with people that I have DID. Right? And the thing is, ZZ is very open about the fact that they have PMDD and also PTSD. And the thing is that I think by being into, like, Vosh has been really clear about this, with being clear about someone who has bipolar. We just talked to Kevels today, who has trauma from the whole Kiwi Farms thing. Like, I think being somebody with mental illness and realizing that, like, speaking about this stuff, not only do you get, I think, more empowered by speaking to it, but in some ways I think that it also gives people an example.
A real example of...
Yeah, a positive example of somebody who's actually dealing with these things and not feel alone. And they also realize there are other examples than just the crazy shit they see on Netflix.
Yeah, well, it's, you know, this is, like, I have a dissociative disorder and PTSD and other stuff as well, but the other part of it with the how this affects people's real life perceptions of this. So my friend 2 years ago lost her father to police violence while he was having an episode. He was completely nonviolent. He was in a park just kind of spinning around, and he had a toy gun. And the police officer who shot him in the who shot him during the trial got off because he said that was the training they received when dealing with a process like that. So it really just kind of feels like that Hollywood just like kicks people who have been down and ain't ever been up when they keep using mental illness as a monster.
And I would say that that's the combination of that's media, but I also would say that's just cop training. The fact that we don't have social workers working with cops going out and specifically trying to de-escalate these situations. I had a client once who was I won't say what their diagnosis is or their gender, but they had an episode of something and were running around with like a stuffed animal, and while they were absolutely in some sort of episode, they weren't violent in any way. And what ended up happening is the cops ended up tasing them, and they had severe trauma from this after the fact. Like, there is a way in which like this stuff is yes, the media fuels it, but also it's that, again, ACAB, like, all cops are bastards. The idea that like you're gonna justify killing a mentally ill person because you made the wrong call because that was your training. No. What the training should be, at least prescriptively, is that it should be able to tell the difference between things. Yeah, you have to make a split-second decision, but the problem is that at least to some degree, that split-second decision, yeah, like if your split-second decision is to do this, and you come up with the wrong like outcome, you should still suffer the consequences. Like, regardless if that's your training or not, you should still suffer the consequences. So we come down to a thing of like, there's an issue of state power here. There's a way that cops aren't held accountable. And so, yeah, I think that like to some degree, this really does come down to like, there's multiple facets to this that add to the question around and the stigmas around mental health. One of them is the cops. The cops are trained to basically treat mental ill people like criminals, which probably feeds into the media perception you're talking about too. Like it may not be as simple as a causal effect from one to the other. They're probably all correlated. But I'm very sorry that happened to your friend, because that's fucking awful.
Yeah. Her father.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, no, I don't think you're too sensitive, and I don't think that you're incorrect on some of this. No.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, it's just kind of like, am I crazy for that? Am I being overly sensitive and like triggered by things, or is this like because that's, you know, a big discourse online with, you know, are we coming from this from a place of being traumatized and maybe not having the best like general take, or is this just like a personal harm to me situation? So it's like with, you know, the whole kink at pride discourse for me is like I have PTSD triggered by femsub stuff, so that's why I'm a little more like, you know, that's why I have some takes about like the kink at pride hypothetically thing, but usually kink at pride is not anything that would, you know, be triggering for me. It's usually like straight people who are being ridiculous. So
yeah. Well, go ahead.
I do think, you know, in your situation, you might need to kind of check where the trauma is or check where reactions are, but that's really only a call that I think you could make, you know. That doesn't mean that your takes aren't valid. It absolutely, you know, in some ways it makes you a lot closer to them than anything. Of like, no, I actually get to see the reality of it, guys. But I think that's got to be a personal call, all things considered.
I think the other thing I would say is that Zizi's completely correct on that, and I also think that the other thing I would add to this is that, yeah, some of this could be your own sensitivities and you be you personally taking offense to this. I want to be clear. Offense doesn't mean that you're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
The way we define this is that offense versus harm is not to invalidate those who are feeling offended. It's to point out that it is a personal offense rather than a systemic claim. Because where the left gets concerned is they turn their personal offenses into systemic claims. Just like the right turns systemic claims into personal offenses. Do you understand?
Mm-hmm.
So what they do is... with the whole like snowflake thing, like, oh, you're just triggered snowflake. A lot of times people are making substantive, like actual systemic critiques, and it's told that they're just acting offended. In the reverse, the left tends to think everything is harm. A good example of this was Essence of Thought's video on Lily Orchard recently, where Essence of Thought claimed that, she was sexually harassed by Lily Orchard when Lily Orchard just put out a general statement that wasn't even targeted at anyone in particular.
Mm-hmm.
I can see how that would be offensive to somebody because what Lily said was derogatory. But does it fall under what I would define as sexual harassment? No. Do I feel like this adds to any kind of systemic harm? No. And that doesn't mean that I don't feel for Ethel for being offended, but to call it a harm in the grand scale is by its nature really, it feels like it's a way to load the dice or load the argument in a way to make it stronger that I think in the long term does really harm when we're talking about these issues. In your case, you're pointing out two separate things. There's the personal offense, and there's a larger systemic claim that the way these things are portrayed does hurt mentally ill people. I mean, fuck, how often is the crazy girlfriend portrayed as having BPD? Trust me, I get it.
And there are a lot of times where people will just outright react based on their perceptions of BPD and not based on what's actually going on in the situation. I think some good examples for chat watching as well would sometimes we see this conflation with, like, let's say you have a particularly problematic show and then trying to claim that show is responsible for all of the societal damage. That's where we might see some of this stuff really like spin out. Claim that this show is bad for all of this group, when really, no, it might not be. And in some cases, no, it might have led to some really crappy stuff. Lindsay Ellis has a good video on trans women in film, or trans people in film.
Quite a good one, yeah. That absolutely adds to that.
Yep. A really good one to continue this take.
So again, I want to be really clear again, like, the whole point of the offense versus harm dichotomy is to point out the difference between individual bother versus very real systemic harm. It is not to invalidate people's things. It's just sometimes people have to own their offense and work with that rather than trying to strengthen it by claiming it's a larger systemic thing. In your case, I think that it is a personal thing for you, and you're also right.
Yeah.
Thank you for validating me. Speaking of which, with the Lindsay Ellis thing, I made a meme of, like, the arms classed, and it's like people with DID, people with trans women in horror movies being depicted as having an alternate murder personality.
Oh, no.
True. Very true. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah.
I'm really glad you're in our Discord. Yeah, please hang around, and feel free to reach out if you need anything.
Yeah, cool. Thank you so much. Y'all have a good evening.
You too. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Also, consider donating to us. You can support us on our website, transgirltherapist.org. You can also help us on our Patreon, link below, or you can become a member here on YouTube. Thank you so much for watching.